Where is the center of gravity when it comes to this development finance, and to what extent is China replacing Western finance?
Thank you, Natalie. Well, very, good to be with you. What the report says is that, we are, as you said in your introduction, we are witnessing a contraction from aid and development finance provided by the West. And when we talk about the West, we talk about the United States, the United Kingdom that has, slashed its aid budget as well, but also many other European countries. Now, it's important to realize that, the Southeast Asia aid map, which is the report that you're talking about that we've just published. This is an exercise that we are doing every year. We've been, updating the numbers every year. And so, consistently, China has been the largest development partner in the region, the largest bilateral development partner in the region. China is spending actually much more than the US, the UK, or any other European countries actually in the region. So when we're saying that the center of gravity is shifting away from Washington and Brussels and closer to Tokyo, to Seoul, or to Beijing, what we're saying is that the contraction and the withdrawal, if you want, of Western partners naturally gives more predominance to the role of Asian donors.
What are the gaps that the Chinese finance is filling? What are they targeting where Western institutions, countries are pulling out from?
Well, again, this is a tough one. The China and the West are doing aid and development finance in two very different ways. For instance, the US or the UK or the EU, they were focusing a lot of their development finance on, you could say, on human development programs. So programs that were focusing on education, on health, on social protection. The Australian government, for instance, we haven't cut our aid program, but we focus a lot on governance, trying to make the public institution of Southeast Asia stronger, more accountable, and so forth. That's what the West by itself is doing in Southeast Asia in terms of development finance. When you look at what China does, it's quite different. In the Southeast Asia aid map, you can compare one donor with another. So we're comparing China with, the US or Australia and so forth. And what we see is that China focuses a lot on infrastructure, big infrastructure projects. And this is very needed in Southeast Asia because, the region is facing an infrastructure, massive infrastructure gap, or massive infrastructure needs. So the fact that, China spends money on infrastructure, think about, railway, think about energy power plants and so forth. This is very important, but the thing is that we don't see China necessarily filling the gaps left by the US in terms of education, health, and governance.
So who's going to be filling that gap?
Yes, good question. Well, at the moment, it is hard to say, because sometime where in previous iteration, we saw that when the US was, retracting from the region where there were money leaving the region, then you had other Western donors, or other what we call traditional development partners filling this gap. But at this stage, it looks like many countries are actually exiting the region. And this is concerning. In Australia, for instance, one of the big jobs that the government has had to do over the past few months, basically since the Trump administration has announced that they were cutting the aid budget, the Australian government has had to basically evaluate the damages and figure out where the bigger gap will be. In terms of both, joint projects, just bilateral projects, or, multilateral financing that the US was providing before to the UN and not providing anymore. So now, they still, traditional partners are still assessing the damages, and we're seeing what are the key areas that we can, in which area we can fill the gap. But the reality is that most Western donors, most traditional partners have a limited aid budget, and this aid budget is actually shrinking in many places. So unfortunately, most of this gap will continue to rise in the coming year.
What would you say is the reaction or the response by the Indo-Pacific, or what is being dubbed as the middle powers, so like Australia, Japan, South Korea, or even India, to China's financial dominance in terms of this ODF, development finance?
Yes, this is, again, a good question. I think when you look at official development finance or aid really going to Southeast Asia, You have to see it in two different prisms. The first one has to do with development purposes. So, we want this financing to, as you said before, fill gaps that are like developmentally important. So, we want basically, but the public institution of Southeast Asia to be strong. We want the education to be well developed. We want the health system to be strong enough to sustain, future pandemics, for instance, and so forth. And so, in this development lens, when you look at aid on a development lens, then it makes sense to have as many, development partners involved in the region. But then there is another one, and that's like the one that we work a lot here at the Lowy Institute, and that's the geopolitical lens. How much aid gives you a geopolitical advantages? Now it's very difficult to draw a direct line between aid and influence, especially in Southeast Asia. But the reality is that what's middle powers, as you call them, what they're trying to do is that we're trying to compete in a way that is efficient with China in the Indo-Pacific. But the problem is, again, we don't have the same firepower. So what I think the Australian government should be doing now, actually, is to collaborate or deepen our collaboration and our cooperation with like-minded partners in Southeast Asia, such as, Japan and Korea that you mentioned. And they are also active in the Pacific. And we should deepen our collaboration with those and really, again, identifying the gap, the strategic gaps that the US is leaving, that the West is leaving, and trying to fill them. But again, at this stage, it is really difficult to know what's going to happen. The one thing that will happen for sure, and this is something that we talk in our report, is that the contraction of Western aid or the exiting of the West is really going to worsen actually the development divide in Southeast Asia, and that might risk, the unity of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Is there any vulnerability by receiving more Chinese aid? I'm talking about geopolitics here and the dynamics as we've seen in the past weeks with the development of Donald Trump and all of his trade talks. We've seen him issue threats to the BRICS countries, warning about their anti-American policies, while also calling on countries to impose secondary sanctions on, I guess the target would be China, without naming China. What would be some of the geopolitical risks from receiving or being the receiving end of more aid from China?
Yeah, this is a question that we're asking ourselves quite a bit, how much does providing aid give you influence in a specific country? So as I mentioned before, China is the main development partner in Southeast Asia, the biggest bilateral partner. It's, according to the Southeast Asia aid map, our numbers show that China is first, then you have Japan and other countries afterwards. The question about, how much influence or how much risk it poses for Southeast Asia to deal with more China is a difficult one. I think on one aspect, receiving more support from China is probably a good thing, again, because China focuses a lot on infrastructure and the region is in dire need of new infrastructure. But at the same time, you have, the way China does its aid and development finance is quite different from the way Australia or like traditional partners are doing development finance. I think in Australia, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to have an understanding of like the needs of the people, the needs of the country, and then make project preparation and so forth, and then we implement the project and we make sure that they have like a strong impact for the people that it serves. In China, it looks like the way China does its aid and development is a bit different, where they deal with the political elite, and therefore sometimes you can have like big projects that the population might not need, but that actually are for the benefits of a small community in those countries. And therefore, you could argue that there would be probably a developmental risk going forward, where more and more Southeast Asian countries are going to be faced with the reality that they have like less and less options in terms of development finance. Western countries are exiting, therefore they're not going to offer their projects. And this means that basically Southeast Asian countries are going to have less option, therefore less agency in negotiating with China better terms for the project. The better terms for the project that they're working on, better quality and so forth. And that's probably the risk that we are anticipating going forward.